Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to a time of muddy boots, awkward stares, and courtship rules so baffling. You might just be glad you're single. Imagine this, you're standing in a medieval field, the sun's just dipping low, casting golden light on rows of turnips. Someone across the furrows gives you a look. Was that a signal? Or just a twitch from bad hay fever? In this world, making a romantic move wasn't just about courage. It was about knowing your place, your crops, and whether your village priest would shame you at Sunday Mass. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start the day with calloused hands, a stomach full of barley stew, and maybe, just maybe, a glimmer of interest in the baker's daughter who sells coarse rye at market. In the peasant world, dating wasn't exactly candlelit dinners and long walks through lavender fields. It was more like eye contact while defeathering chickens, or offering an extra turnip at the stall. Still, it mattered. Romance was alive, in its own dirt-caked way. The rhythms of daily life offered precious few chances for interaction. Harvest time, feast days, or helping repair a neighbor's roof, these were moments of mingling. Socializing usually meant chores with an audience, which meant any attempt at courtship had to be sneakier than a fox in the pantry. A sideways glance during a May Day dance could spark months of speculation, and occasionally a brawl. Of course, everything depended on rank. You might think peasants had fewer rules. Actually, their love lives were micromanaged by local customs, elders, and the church. In some areas, there were even fines for lewd behavior, which could include something as scandalous as kissing behind a haystack. And yes, someone was probably watching from behind a pig pen. A historical fact that's kind of delightful. In certain villages, there were actual festivals where unmarried men and women were permitted just once a year to publicly flirt. These were heavily chaperoned, naturally, and any coupling had to be confirmed with a handshake and maybe a goat. But courtship among peasants wasn't all eye contact and innuendo. Occasionally, someone might present a handmade trinket woven rushes, carved wooden spoons, or, in one documented case, a dried frog, no explanation given. If accepted, it meant I like you. If rejected, well, hope you enjoy a winter of emotional frostbite and communal embarrassment. One quirky tidbit. In some parts of the British Isles, there was a tradition called bundling. A boy and girl could spend the night in bed fully clothed, separated by a bundling board, or seconder strict surveillance. Supposedly, this helped them get to know each other. More likely, it helped Grandma make sure no one got too cozy. Historians still argue whether this was genuinely innocent, or just a cleverly disguised prelude to wedding bells. Or scandal. There was also a kind of peasant matchmaking that defied today's romantic ideals. If two families agreed, that was that. Your opinion, at best, came last. But if the chemistry fizzled, divorce wasn't an option, though annulment sometimes happened, if the marriage was, well, less than enthusiastic on the wedding night. And even with all that, people found ways. They whispered during sheep shearing. They carved hearts into trees. They shared boiled eggs at sunrise like it was champagne and strawberries. Because even in a world of dirt floors and lice combs, people still fell in love awkwardly, nervously, and often with the wrong person. It's comforting, in a way. Love, at its most basic level, has always been absurd and hopeful. A boy nervously combing his hair with grease before heading to market. A girl pretending not to notice. A chicken squawking in the background. Somehow, that was romance. Of course, trouble brewed quickly. Gossip in medieval villages spread faster than smoke from a kitchen fire. One misinterpreted touch, one unwise rendezvous by the river, and suddenly your name was dragged through every stewpot in town. That's why many medieval courtships felt more like espionage than affection. Strategic timing, trusted allies, a lookout near the well, and the rules. Incomprehensible. In one region, you could declare your intentions by giving someone a garland of marjoram. In another, that same gift meant, I hope your pigs get mange. Local customs were everything. and misunderstandings were many. It's no wonder some people just stayed single out of sheer confusion. Still, the pursuit continued. Because even in a life dictated by frost and famine, there was something thrilling about catching someone's eye during Mass, or brushing hands while picking berries. These moments, tiny as they were, mattered. They made life feel briefly, beautifully different. So next time you complain about ghosting, or dating apps that match you with someone 800 miles away, who thinks ketchup is spicy, remember your medieval counterpart. They probably risked excommunication, livestock fines, and communal snickering just to say, "Hey, I like your hair under that wimple." You're barely into your second cup of mead when the church bell rings again. It always seems to toll right when you're about to enjoy something. A quiet sunrise, a flirtatious look, or a moment where your hands meet someone else's over the same cabbage. That's medieval dating, for you forever, shadowed by the long, watchful arm of the church. Back then, romance wasn't just a matter of two hearts and some mutual beet harvesting. No, it was a moral minefield navigated under strict ecclesiastical supervision. The church didn't just frown on passionate behavior. It often tried to dictate exactly when, how, and if you were even allowed to notice someone. Dating as we know it was about as welcome as a devil in the confessional. First and foremost, you had to be eligible. That might sound obvious, but the criteria were both stringent and strange. You couldn't be related within 7 degrees of consanguinity, a mathematical puzzle few could solve. There were also bans on marrying your godparent, step-sibling, or anyone you'd ever made a vague vow to, even as a joke. One wrong connection, and your flirtation could be declared spiritually incestuous. If you managed to tick all the boxes, the next hurdle was how you courted. The church's rules were very clear. No touching, no kissing, no immodest looks, and definitely no promises made in private. That means no sneaking off behind the stable for whispered sweet nothings, unless you wanted to do penance. In public, wearing nothing but sackcloth and shame. Romantic one mainstream fact many don't realize. Priests were required to investigate relationships. That's right, your parish priest might ask your neighbors if you were behaving too affectionately toward the miller's daughter. And if things looked suspicious, you could be called before a local court for fornication or pre-contract. Just imagine trying to explain that you were only helping her gather firewood while sweating through a public inquiry led by a bishop with no sense of humor. One quirky detail worth picturing. In parts of 13th century France, couples had to announce their engagement 3 Sundays in a row, out loud, during church mass. If nobody objected, congrats, you could marry. But if even one person stood up and said, "I saw them holding hands before Lent," the whole thing could be paused indefinitely. The medieval version of a comment section, but with more consequences. Historians still argue whether the church's heavy hand helped preserve social order, or simply made romance so frustrating that people got more creative. It's an open debate. Did these strictures encourage true commitment, or just turn everyone into better liars? There's certainly no shortage of medieval love poems where the speaker moans about having to sneak past a chapel just to say hello. Let's not forget the seasonal bans. That's right, there were periods during the church calendar when getting married, or even courting publicly, was forbidden. Advent, Lent, certain saints, feast days, all off limits. If you found the love of your life in February, you might have to wait until Easter just to admit it. Think of it like God imposed do not disturb settings, but without a snooze button. And then there was the church's concept of spiritual love, which was all well and good in theory. Devotion, loyalty, purity, all noble goals. But try explaining that two 20-year-olds passing each other at the spring fair with flushed cheeks and hormones stronger than common sense. For them, spiritual love probably sounded a lot like eternal celibacy with extra prayers. It didn't help that sermons were often full of fire and brimstone. Passion, they warned, was a gateway to damnation. Lust was a sin of the flesh. A wandering eye was practically treason against heaven. So, every bashful romantic gesture had to be wrapped in layers of guilt, penance, and plausible deniability. I wasn't admiring her hair. Father, I was making sure it was properly covered by her veil. But of course, people didn't always listen. because even the most righteous village had a couple who defied the rules, holding hands behind the chapel, sneaking into the barn during evening prayers, making eye contact for a fraction too long. And while the punishments could be harsh, public flogging, penance, annulment, they rarely stopped love entirely. They just made it quieter, cleverer, more coded. Take, for instance, the subtle courtship that might unfold in the churchyard. You light a candle at the same altar. You time your exit to walk beside them. You compliment their oxen's fine condition code, for I like you. It's all done under the cloak of religious observance, with every glance justified as spiritual admiration. Except, everyone knows what's really going on, including the priest, and sometimes even priests themselves were part of the drama. Despite vows of celibacy, history is littered with clerical lovers, secret marriages, and illegitimate children who mysteriously resembled their local pastor. The rules may have been strict, but enforcement, well, let's just say it depended on the season and who was watching. You might even encounter the occasional holy wingman, an older parishioner, or even a kind-hearted nun, who, understanding the yearning behind all those bowed heads, might whisper some advice or arrange a chaperoned meeting behind the bakery. After all, love makes fools of us all, even in sanctified robes. By the end of the day, you return home tired from hauling grain, and even more tired from pretending you aren't thinking about someone's smile. You light a tallow candle and replay the brief, blessed moment your eyes met across the bread stall, hoping that tomorrow, if the priest doesn't look too closely, you might get to say more than just, "Peace be with you." Your boots are caked in mud from the road to the manor, and your back aches from carrying 3 bundles of firewood. But somehow, you still stand a little taller today, because you've just received a note folded twice, tucked into a pouch, of lavender, and passed to you by a giggling servant girl, who refuses to admit she was involved. The handwriting is elegant, the wording tortuously vague. My heart, like a caged bird, sings only when your shadow graces the east stair. You blink twice. What does that mean? And also, is this actually happening? Welcome to the high drama of courtly love, where affection isn't shown through casual conversation or joint ownership of livestock, but through melancholic poetry, smoldering stares, and a level of emotional suppression that would impress even the most stoic modern introvert. Among the nobility, love wasn't something you pursued because you were lonely. It was an ideal, a performance, a lifestyle. The idea of courtly love emerged in the 12th century, especially among the elite, in places like Aquitaine and Provence, where troubadours sang aching ballads about unrequited devotion to unreachable women. The perfect romance, ironically, was the one that could never be consummated. Here's your mainstream fact for the evening. The woman was usually married. That's right, most of these literary love affairs involved a nobleman pining for his lord's wife, a married duchess, or some other high-born lady who was completely off, which of course made it all the more exciting. Forbidden fruit was practically a requirement for the courtly love starter kit. The rules, oh, they were absurd. Love had to be secret, respectful, painful, and poetic. You wrote verses. You jousted in her name. You wore her sleeve on your lance. You maybe touched her hand at a feast, if she was feeling particularly generous, and the bishop had turned his head. But anything more, scandal, possibly even death. Or, worse, exile to a really boring part of France. One famous real-life example, the love between Peter Abelard and Heloise. He was a philosopher. She was a brilliant scholar. Their affair was intense, passionate, and unsurprisingly ended in tragedy, castration, and monastic vows. But their letters live on, filled with longing and philosophy, and a kind of existential agony that only medieval lovers and goth teenagers can truly understand. A quirky twist here. Some noblewomen expected multiple suitors. You weren't meant to just fall in love with one guy and settle down. No, you cultivated admirers, like rosebush, gently, carefully, with just enough thorns. They'd duel for your favor, write odes, comparing your forehead to a moonlit meadow, and collapse into existential despair if you so much as looked disinterested. Historians still argue whether this whole courtly love culture reflected real relationships, or was just elaborate literary cosplay. Was it truly a form of romantic expression, or just a coded way to keep bored nobles entertained while their spouses were off crusading? The line between fantasy and social ritual is fuzzy at best, and speaking of fantasy, some of the gestures were ... peculiar. One knight reportedly wore a chainmail shirt full of thorns under his tunic as proof of his devotion. Another drank water from his lady's footprint. One especially desperate soul carved her name into his own thigh with a dagger. That's love, medieval style. Equal parts devotion and poor medical decisions. Then there were the rules laid out in love manuals. Yes, those existed. One of the most famous was De Amore, by Andreas Capellanus, a 12th century guide to how noble love should be pursued. Rule number 4. Jealousy increases love. Rule number 13. When one lover dies, a widowhood of 2 years is required of the survivor. And my personal favorite, nothing forbids one woman from being loved by 2 men, or 1 man by 2 women. Basically, medieval dating advice came with footnotes, moral loopholes, and absolutely zero chill. Now, imagine you're a young knight. You're sworn to a lady you barely know. You write her a sonnet, tie her colors to your lance, and head into a tournament, hoping she'll look your way. You take a lance to the ribs, black out briefly, and wait to see her frowning politely. She hands you a handkerchief, not her best one, mind you, just a slightly stained backup hand, whispers, "Good effort." You swoon. She returns to her embroidery. This wasn't about happy endings. In fact, the whole point of courtly love was that it never really ended, because it never truly began. It was longing stretched across seasons, disguised as virtue, passion wrapped in etiquette, emotional masochism masquerading as nobility. And yet people believed in it, or at least they enjoyed pretending to. Castles rang with lute music. Gardens hosted whispered rendezvous. Letters were penned by candlelight, signed with fake names, and dripped wax. Whether it led to secret affairs, or just better poetry, the emotional theater of courtly love defined medieval romance for centuries. So, if you've ever sent a text and waited 3 days for a reply, take heart. At least you didn't have to. Compose a 48-line rhyming poem in Latin and tie it to a pigeon's leg. Progress, my friend. By the time you trudge back to your quarters, the moon is high, and the castle halls are quiet. You reread that cryptic letter again, still unsure what it means. Your shadow graces the east stair. Is that a signal? A metaphor? A riddle? You shrug, tuck it under your pillow, and fall asleep wondering whether she'll look your way. At tomorrow's feast or send another note, via lavender-smelling messenger. You're about to sneak a glance at your would-be beloved, across the courtyard. When Bama matronly figure steps directly into your line of sight. She's dressed in layers of wool, her eyes sharper than a falcon's, and she's holding a rosary like a weapon. Yep, that's the chaperone. And she's not going anywhere. In medieval romance, it didn't matter how noble, poetic, or star-crossed your love was. If you weren't married, you weren't alone ever. Whether you were a duchess or a milkmaid, someone was always watching, and more often than not, that someone was a professional vibe killer. The chaperone. Their job was simple in theory, but exhausting in practice. Chaperones were tasked with preventing anything that could be construed as flirtation, which, as it turns out, is basically everything. A smile held too long, sinful hands brushing in the garden. Scandalous. Standing too close in a corridor with low candlelight. Repent immediately. It sounds a little ridiculous now, but remember, reputation was everything. A single rumor could ruin your marriage prospects faster than you could say dowry dispute. So noble families, ever paranoid about scandal, often assigned older female relatives mothers, aunts, widowed cousins, to hover like protective geese. Some even trained servants specifically to eavesdrop, shadow, and report back. It was like medieval dating came with its own in-house surveillance department. One mainstream historical fact. In royal courts, even letter exchanges had to pass through official channels. That meant you didn't just scribble a love note and send it via stable boy. You had to give it to a trusted intermediary, who then presented it to the lady's chaperone, who might allow her to read it under supervision. If the message was too spicy, say, it used the word passion, or, heaven forbid, mentioned lipsit might be censored altogether. The most committed chaperones went above and beyond. There are accounts of women standing within earshot at all times, sleeping in the same room as the lady, and even following her into the garden under the guise of herbal collection privacy. Not even a whisper. Some even devised signal systems, such as fake coughing or foot stomping, to interrupt conversations getting too emotionally intimate. Love had to be stealthy, or absurdly patient. One quirky twist. There were chaperone loopholes. A particularly clever couple might find an understanding mindera, sympathetic aunt who missed her own shot at love and enjoyed watching the young suffer deliciously. Others bribed servants to distract the guardian with errands, gossip, or even food. A well-timed meat pie could buy you 5 blessed minutes of semi-private conversation by the orchard. Still, most couples learned to adapt. They created entire languages of movement and glance. A dropped glove meant, "I miss you." A slightly crooked brooch said, "Meet me by the North Tower." Even posture played a role, leaning forward too much. That's practically a marriage proposal. Standing too close during a game of chess. Reckless. Historians still argue whether chaperones were genuinely effective or just part of the performance. After all, plenty of love affairs blossomed under their watchful eyes. Maybe their presence simply added more tension. Romance as theater, with a built-in audience and the ever-present risk of being caught mid-swoon. And while female chaperones were the norm, don't count out the stern, male versions. Fathers, uncles, and brothers often filled this role with a little extra menace. A protective older brother might happen to be polishing his sword when a suitor arrived. A father might linger too long near the fire, reminding everyone he'd fought in 3 border skirmishes and wasn't afraid of drawing blood over a rumor, subtle. Then there were the group dates, medieval style. When 2 people wanted to spend time together, it was usually within a larger setting, a hunt, a feast, a pilgrimage, or even a sewing circle for the women. These gatherings were technically social, but everyone knew which couples were orbiting one another. It became a polite dance of pretending not to notice while watching very closely. One of the strangest scenarios, the window courtship. In towns and cities, a suitor might stand below a lady's window for hours, reciting poetry, singing songs, or just ... being present. She'd remain upstairs, often with a chaperone, watching from behind a curtain. Romantic, maybe awkward. Definitely, and possibly cold. Occasionally, families would hire a chaperone, known for being particularly strict. One infamous woman in 14th century Milan was said to have carried a long wooden spoon, which she used to thwack any suitor who stood too close. Did it work? Hard to say, but it certainly added spice to the relationship. Still, in quieter moments, even the most overbearing chaperones sometimes softened. A late afternoon, the lady dozing with her embroidery in her lap, the guardian nodding off in her chair. There were moments, tiny and precious, when 2 young people could exchange a sentence or a touch without comment. These glimmers of privacy, rare as they were, could become the kind of memory you held onto for years. In the end, the presence of chaperones didn't kill romance, it reshaped it. Love had to be clever, respectful, and above all, patient. Modern couples might get frustrated by unread texts. In medieval times, you'd wait 3 months to hear someone say, "I think about you" via coded embroidery. So when you turn in for the night, thinking about that girl who smiled at you across the cloister garden, you do it knowing she's probably being watched, even now, by a sleepy old woman, clutching a rosary and whispering, "Not on my watch." The morning mist clings low to the fields, and you clutch a carefully wrapped bundle in your cloak. Inside isn't food or coin, it's your latest love token. You hope it makes the right impression this time. Last week, you gave her a silver thimble and got a polite nod. The week before that, a hand-carved spoon shaped like a swanshee smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. This time, you've gone bold. A single falcon feather, wrapped in wool, dyed with madder root. Romantic. Hopefully, slightly unhinged. Also yes, because in the medieval world, when words failed or, when speaking them might result in a ruined reputation or an angry priest, objects did the talking. Welcome to the strange, symbolic realm of medieval love tokens and gifts. Forget flowers and chocolate. This was a time of symbolic jewelry, bloodied tokens, and, occasionally, small animals. Love, after all, had to be creative. You might be a knight returning from battle with a bit of the cloth you wore while defending your lady's honor. Not washed, of course grime and blood were proof of sincerity. Or maybe you were a scribe, and you carefully folded a dried sprig of rosemary between the pages of a poem, hoping your beloved would understand it meant fidelity. You see, in this world, every plant, object, and gesture was part of a language more intricate than the local dialect. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Exchanging personal items was often a precursor to marriage. A lady might give her suitor a ring, a piece of her veil, or a token embroidered with her family's crest. He, in turn, might gift her a clasp, a buckle, or even a coin with a hole in it, a medieval way of saying, "You complete me." Also, this coin now has no monetary value. One beloved item, the favor, a piece of ribbon, cloth, or lace tied to a knight's arm before a tournament. During the joust, everyone watching would know exactly which lady he was riding for. It was a kind of public declaration, like putting your relationship status on your coat of arms. If he lost the joust, well, awkward. But if he won, hearts fluttered, especially hers. Some tokens were more intimate, if not a little bizarre. Locks of hair were common, sometimes woven into bracelets, or even tucked into religious relics, because nothing says "I adore you" like hiding your beloved's braid inside a saint's toe bone. In rare cases, lovers exchanged teeth. That's not a joke. Historians still argue whether this was a gesture of deep trust, or just a really weird flex. And then, there's the gift that keeps on confusing. Dead animals. No, really. A falcon, for instance, wasn't just a fancy bird. It symbolized nobility, loyalty, and fierce devotion. Giving someone a hunting bird was a power move. Other symbolic animals included doves, purity, rabbits, fertility, which the church definitely had opinions about, and dogs' faithfulness. One documented account from Burgundy involves a noblewoman who received a hedgehog in a silver cage. What it meant remains ... unclear. Not all gifts were tangible. A serenade beneath a window, a dance performed at a feast, a poem stitched into a garment, these too were tokens. A knight might compose a verse comparing his lady to the moon, then have it embroidered into the hem of her underdress, which meant her chaperone never saw it, but she knew it was there, brushing against her legs with every step. Quirky detail time. There's a record of a 14th century German courtship involving baked goods in increasingly odd shapes. It began with a heart-shaped bread, escalated to a doughy dove, and ended in a large pretzel formed into two figures holding hands. She said yes. Historians still debate whether the carbs helped, but not all love tokens were romantic in the soft focus sense. Some were dramatic. Bloody handkerchiefs from jousts, broken arrowheads from hunting trips. One knight is said to have gifted his lady a stone from the well, where he nearly drowned, his way of saying, "I'd die for you." A bit intense, but that was kind of the point. Drama equaled devotion. Historians still argue whether these gifts were always heartfelt, or sometimes strategic. Was a falcon feather truly a symbol of love, or just a showy way to impress a rich family? Was a carved spoon romantic, or just the only thing you were allowed to own after your second cousin took your inheritance? As with so much in medieval life, the line between sincerity and strategy was often as thin as a linen veil. Even peasant lovers found ways to participate in the tradition, albeit with humbler offerings. A freshly caught fish, a well-polished pebble, a ribbon dyed with crushed beetles, surprisingly vibrant, slightly smelly. One farm boy supposedly gave his crush a hen that laid oddly shaped eggs. That was either true love, or he was really proud of his poultry. Of course, these gifts weren't always welcomed. Sometimes, they missed the mark. A noblewoman might scoff at a poorly penned poem. A father might confiscate a hair ribbon if it came from a rival family. A priest might demand penance if the gift seemed too suggestive. And if the gift involved anything vaguely magical herb, stones, strange symbols, it might be labeled witchcraft. Whoops. Still, the exchange of tokens added texture and meaning to courtship. They were objects made heavy with feeling, passed hand to hand with trembling fingers. They became memories, heirlooms, sometimes even bargaining chips in future marriage negotiations. So when you tuck that falcon feather into her glove at the feast tonight, you do it slowly, reverently. You don't say a word. But maybe, just maybe, she wear it tomorrow. And that will be the loudest yes you'll ever hear. The fire crackles low in the manor's kitchen hearth, and somewhere just beyond the door, someone slips a folded note beneath a basket of onions. You wait for the scullery maid to leave, casually stroll past, and heart-thudding, you scoop it up like you're checking for rats. That's medieval texting for you. Sneaky, coded, and just as watching those three little dots on a modern screen. Because if you really wanted to talk to your sweetheart in the Middle Ages, you had to be part poet, part spy. Enter the world of secret notes and improvised message delivery systems, otherwise known as medieval direct messaging. It sounds romantic now, but in the moment, it was all nerves and logistics. You couldn't simply say what you felt. That could be dangerous, or at least reputationally suicidal. So you folded your affection into layers of metaphor, dropped it into the pocket of a servant, and hoped it reached the right hands, and wasn't intercepted by the wrong ones. A mainstream historical fact, written communication between lovers wasn't just popular, it was a thriving tradition. Nobles often used trained scribes to help craft elegant missives filled with longing, Latin, and an alarming number of bird metaphors. Literacy was limited, of course, especially among the peasantry, but among the literate elite, a heartfelt letter could travel hundreds of miles by horse, pigeon, or luckless footman, and it wasn't just what you said, it was how you folded it. Yes, really. There was a system called letter locking, where people folded and sealed their letters in distinct ways to prevent tampering. Some folds were so intricate they're still being studied today. Think of it as the medieval version of password protection with wax seals instead of biometrics. Now for the fun, quirky stuff. Not all notes were elegant. Some were barely legible, scrawled in haste with ink made from soot and spit. Others were cryptic, composed entirely in verse or referencing shared inside jokes. One 14th century lover wrote to his lady using a full page of bird calls as metaphors. She replied with an entire poem comparing his loyalty to that of a migratory goose. It's unclear whether that was flattering. And if you couldn't retort feared discovery, you got creative. Lovers used prayer books to pass messages. You'd leave yours open to a specific psalm, with a pressed flower on the page. The intended would borrow it, read between the lines, sometimes literally, and send it back with her own coded reply tucked into the margins. So much for quiet devotion. Historians still argue whether these exchanges were widespread or limited to the courtly elite. Some suggest that even among merchants and wealthier peasants, love letters circulated in secret, especially as paper and ink became more accessible in the later Middle Ages. Others believe these tales are exaggerated, relics of romanticized chronicles written centuries after the fact. Either way, the notion of slipping a note behind a curtain endures. Of course, there were risks. A letter intercepted could mean disaster. In one case, from 1321, a nobleman's love note addressed to a married woman was discovered by her maid, who showed it to the lady's husband. The nobleman was stripped of title, lands, and dignity. The lady, she was shipped off to a nunnery. The maid got a small silver coin. Moral: always tip your messengers. Then there were delivery methods. Some used animals, especially homing pigeons. Others relied on trusted servants. In more rural settings, even the town's bell ringer might be roped into service. Paid a few coppers to drop a note accidentally in the bakery queue. There's one tale of a monk who used the monastery's laundry line to exchange embroidered handkerchiefs with a village girl that ended predictably badly. And don't forget oral messages. If writing was too risky, you found someone with a good memory and strong loyalties. A wet nurse, an aging gardener, a half-deaf uncle, anyone who could repeat a message verbatim without edit. That last bit was crucial. Misquoted metaphors were the medieval equivalent of autocorrect disasters. My love for you flows like the Tiber, quickly turned into your goat, smells like a river. Even among the nobility, lovers often had to share writing space. A favorite trick: composing a love poem under the guise of a tribute to a saint. Your eyes shine like the holy stars that watched over St. Agnes in her trial. Sounds pious unless you know St. Agnes was the patron of chastity, and the letter includes veiled invitations to midnight strolls. But perhaps the most delicious form of secret messaging was embroidery. A lady might stitch a phrase into the lining of a tunic or the edge of a handkerchief. Something easily missed by outsiders, but clear to the recipient. "Remember the yew tree," one hymn might say. Or "East wall, full moon, stitched in pale thread against linen." Medieval textile, yes. Romantic scavenger hunt, also yes. For those without skills in verse or needlework, tokens often spoke in place of letters. A red thread twisted 3 times might mean "I wait for you." A torn ribbon left under a bench meant "meet me here again." Some even used flowers as a full vocabulary, though, with regional variations, which led to some awkward misunderstandings. A lily might mean purity in one county, and "I'm done with you" in another. And then there were the mistakes. One poor soul in 1297 sent a note meant for his lover to her mother by accident. It included phrases such as, "Your skin haunts my dreams, and I would duel a dragon for your embrace." The mother fainted. The father called for a priest. The romance ended before it even started. Medieval inbox errors were unforgiving. So, tonight, as you tuck your note under a pew, or pass it to a messenger boy with strict instructions not to read it, you feel your stomach twist. You've chosen your words carefully, folded the paper just right, and sealed it with a drop of wax, and all the hope in your pounding heart. If she writes back, just once you'll know, the feeling was real. The sun's high now, and the town square buzzes with activity vendors shouting, pigs squealing, children darting between carts. But all your attention is on the edge of the gathering, where she stands with a basket of herbs, pretending not to see you. You don't move toward her yet. No one does. Because here, during a medieval festival or public dance, every glance, every footstep, every flick of the wrist is governed by a set of rules so complex it could give a chess master a migraine. This is where flirtation goes public, where love takes the floor, but only if your timing, eye contact, and social rank are perfectly aligned. Welcome to the highly choreographed world of medieval dances, fairs, and festivals, some of the few sanctioned spaces for mingling between those fluttering with affection. A mainstream historical fact: medieval festivals were often tied to religious calendars, feast days, saints' anniversaries, harvest celebrations. But under the holy banners and market stalls, something far less pious was happening. These gatherings were some of the only times unmarried people could interact semi-freely. They were also crawling with chaperones, gossips, and enough social traps to keep the poets busy for weeks. But the dances, that's where things got really interesting. Unlike modern clubbing, where you can sort of flail until someone notices you, medieval dances were structured. Think formal steps, designated partners, and music that sounded more like droning fiddles than party anthems. If you wanted to ask someone to dance, you had to do it in front of everyone, and you better have the right status, or risk serious embarrassment. A peasant asking a noble. Not unless you enjoyed being laughed into next week. Still, when two people of equal rank locked eyes across the hay-strewn floor and stepped toward each other, magic, or at least the closest thing to it, under the judgmental glare of Sister Margaret and a nearby goat. One quirky detail: there was a flirtation tactic involving dance handkerchiefs. You'd let yours accidentally drop during the second, passive or real, and if your partner picked it up and tucked it into their sleeve, it meant interest. If they stepped over it, rejection. Medieval ghosting via embroidery. Historians still argue whether these interactions were more performative than emotional. Were dances really a chance to spark love, or just carefully controlled theater to keep passions in check? It's hard to say, but letters and poems from the era suggest that a single dance could haunt someone's dreams for months. Now, festivals themselves offered more than dances. There were games, tug of war, archery contests, races where you could show off just enough to impress. You might accidentally let your beloved win a game of bowls, or very deliberately outbake her brother in a pie contest. Subtle? No. effective. Sometimes eye contact, by the way, was a currency all its own. Too much, and you were seen as forward. Too little, and you were cold. But just enough, that flutter of the eyes across a maypole ribbon, or over a shared mug of spiced wine. That was everything. And then there were the fortune tellers, usually old women with a knack for guessing your secrets. They offered love predictions for a coin or a crust of bread. You will marry before the next frost, she'd say, eyes glinting, or beware the one who wears green. Lovers often visited together, pretending it was for fun, but secretly hoping for a prophecy that justified holding hands behind the wheat wagon. Music played a role too. Minstrels often customized lyrics during performances, slipping names or initials into verses. If your name suddenly showed up in a rhyme about roses and longing, you flushed. Everyone noticed. And if the person beside you smiled, that was practically a love confession. One particularly quirky tradition came during midsummer festivals, jumping over bonfires. If a couple leaped the flames together and held hands without letting go, it was said they'd marry within the year. If they let go mid-air, doomed. Naturally, people took this very seriously. Sprained ankles and singed tunics were not uncommon. Festivals were also the backdrop for some of the more playful rituals like the apple toss. A girl might throw an apple toward a crowd of boys. If someone caught it and bit into it, tradition said they'd be wed by the next harvest. Of course, it also meant publicly declaring your interest. No pressure, just the entire village watching. Historians believe these rituals, while light-hearted on the surface, functioned as subtle matchmaking tools. In a society with limited options and strict boundaries, these moments of playful openness gave love a rare opportunity to surface. And for many, a successful exchange during a festival could lead to more private meetings. Chaperoned, of course, and, eventually, to marriage talks. But it wasn't all smooth dancing and apple-flavored destiny. For every couple who locked eyes across the bread stall, there were 10 awkward misfires. Someone misreads a smile. Someone steps on a toe during the bransel. Someone gives their festival garland to the wrong sibling. The embarrassment could echo for seasons. And worse still, some moments of genuine connection got cut short by a stern glance from a parent, or a callback to chores. Even so, these brief windows mattered, for people whose days were filled with toil, prayer, and repetition. A festival was like a breath of fresh air, and sometimes the only chance they had to imagine something more. So as the drums begin again, and the couples line up for the next round of dancing, you take a step forward. She's across from you, eyes bright, a faint smirk playing on her lips. You raise your hand. She doesn't drop her gaze. That's all the invitation you need. The path to marriage, as you're now learning, isn't a straight line. It's more like a muddy cart trail with a dozen forks, a few surprise ditches, and a goat that refuses to move. You've danced the dances. You've passed the notes. You've exchanged meaningful glances across crowded feast halls. And now, it's time for the next step in your medieval romance, the premarital negotiations, otherwise known as the dowry games. Because here's the thing, you don't just marry for love. You marry for land, for goats, for linen chests, for half a vineyard and the rights to 3 fish ponds, and possibly a slightly cracked butter churn. Welcome to one of the most bewildering parts of medieval dating. Love meets property. A mainstream historical fact here. Marriage in medieval Europe was, first and foremost, a contract, a legally binding, family-approved, heavily negotiated affair. While romantic love might flutter around the edges, it was rarely the deciding factor. Especially among the upper and middle classes, marriage was about alliances, status, and ensuring your grandchildren wouldn't be broke or excommunicated. This is when your parents were more likely. Your father stepped in with the enthusiasm of a merchant at a spring fair. The goal? To broker the best possible deal. How many sheep? What kind of land? Were any debts included? Was there a morning gift, a token from the groom to the bride on the morning after the wedding? And most awkwardly, was the bride still untouched? Let's just say this part of the process came with its share of uncomfortable silences and long sighs. And then there's the dowry. the bride's family's contribution to the marital pot. It might include land, livestock, household goods, or even a promise of future favors, like securing a job for the groom's third cousin in the monastery scriptorium. The wealthier the dowry, the more desirable the bride. This turned some marriage negotiations into a bidding war, especially if multiple suitors were sniffing around the same inheritance. On the flip side, the bride price, sum paid by the groom's family to the brides, was more common among peasants and in certain regions. Think of it as saying, "We recognize your family is losing a valuable worker, so here's compensation," and maybe a pig. Unromantic, sure, but deeply practical. And speaking of practicality, let's not forget the marriage contract. Yes, a literal document test, leisurely among nobles laying out the terms. If the couple split, or if someone accidentally joined a convent after 6 months, what happened to the dowry? What about inheritance? Could the new wife bring her own maid, or was she expected to fold seamlessly into her husband's household, like an extra cupboard? One quirky detail: in some regions, especially in parts of France and Italy, potential grooms had to prove their suitability, not just financially, but physically. Not in the scandalous way you might think. This was about strength, health, and, occasionally, the ability to manage livestock. There are records of one man impressing his future in-laws by wrestling a wild boar. Another simply had all his teeth, which was considered a great sign of fertility. Standards varied. Historians still argue whether these negotiations empowered or restricted women. On one hand, many young women had no say at all in their marriages, used as chess pieces in family strategies. On the other, savvy women and mothers sometimes orchestrated impressive deals, leveraging a rare but valuable blend of charm, patience, and political timing. Some girls refused matches outright, risking everything to hold out for someone they actually liked. Not many, but a brave few. And what about love in all of this? It was there sometimes. Some couples married with deep affection. Others discovered love over time, like moss slowly creeping across a stone wall. And some never found it, spending decades in companionable silence, raising children, tending flocks, and only occasionally sighing toward the horizon. Once the deal was struck, there was still the matter of public declarations. These often took place over multiple Sundays during church. May remember that. The priest would announce the couple's intent to marry and invite any objections. Speak now or forever hold your peace, medieval style. It was a tense few weeks. Jealous rivals, forgotten pre-contracts, or distant cousins with suspiciously familiar noses could all throw a spanner in the works. And if someone did object, the wedding was paused, investigations were made, witnesses summoned, letters examined. One famous case in 1382 dragged on for 7 years, because someone claimed he'd kissed the bride too passionately at a midsummer festival. That was, apparently, enough to count as a contract. You can imagine how thrilled the families were. But if all went smoothly, then finally came the betrothal ceremony. This wasn't the wedding yet, but it was serious. Hands clasped, vows spoken, sometimes even rings exchanged. In some parts of Europe, a betrothal was as binding as marriage. Break it, and you could be fined or worse, excommunicated. One lovely quirk: some betrothed couples would eat a shared cake, baked with symbolic spices like cinnamon for warmth and ginger for passion. Sometimes they'd even carve their initials into a tree, or press their hands into soft clay as a record. Romantic, yes, and also just a touch ominous. After that, it was a waiting game. Between betrothal and marriage, time crawled. Letters were exchanged or dictated to someone literate, gifts passed back and forth, and nerves built up. For women, it was a time of preparing linens and receiving whispered advice from older female relatives. For men, it was mostly worrying about finances, making sure the roof didn't leak, and pretending not to be terrified. So here you are, crouched behind a hedge, listening to your parents discuss sheep with her uncle. It's not the most romantic moment, but it's real. It's the Middle Ages. This is love, logistics, and land deeds all tied up in one very tense conversation. And if the goat doesn't interrupt again, you might just pull this off. It's a clear morning, and you've never felt more exposed. You've got a tunic that doesn't quite fit right, a hairstyle that was fashionable last harvest, and a belly full of nerves. Because today's the day your name gets read aloud before the whole parish. The day everyone finds out you're officially getting married. Welcome to the banns those 3 consecutive Sunday announcements in church that were supposed to alert the village and God, presumably, of your intention to wed. The priest steps up, clears his throat, and announces, if anyone knows of any lawful impediment why this man and this woman should not be joined. You already know the words, everyone does, but hearing them out loud, attached to your name, that's something else. This, dear listener, was the final stretch before a medieval wedding, a time filled with rituals, rumors, preparations, and more opportunities for things to go hilariously or tragically wrong. A mainstream historical fact. In most of Christian Europe, public marriage announcements were not optional. The church needed to make sure you weren't already married to someone else, a common enough problem. Or secretly related, another common issue, considering how tiny some towns were. The banns gave the community a chance to object, or at least whisper furiously in the pews. But assuming no one stood up in protest and, no surprise, cousins materialized, your union was finally approved. Sort of. Because now came the elaborate, chaotic, and often exhausting task of putting on a wedding with medieval flair. Step 1. Get the blessing, not just from the church, but from your local lord, or manor holder, especially if you were a serf or tenant farmer. Marrying without permission could mean fines, or, in some cases, being forced to separate, and nobles. They didn't just marry, they strategized. Whole estates hinged on the right match. Entire wars were prevented or started by the right handfasting. One quirky tradition. In parts of England and Scotland, couples sometimes underwent a handfasting ceremony, a temporary union that lasted a year and a day. If at the end of that time they were still in love, and not already dead, they could marry properly. Think of it as a medieval trial period love with a warranty. Then there was the matter of where you got married. By the late Middle Ages, the church was trying to centralize weddings inside the church building itself. But for much of the era, marriages happened right outside, literally on the church steps. Why? Because it was considered a public contract, and the front door was the most visible place in the village. Nothing says romance like sealing your vows within arm's reach of the chicken coop and Brother Thomas's begging bowl. And what about the dress? Here's a surprise. Brides didn't usually wear white. That's a Victorian invention. In the medieval period, you wore your best outfit whatever color it was. Red was popular. So was green. Blue, often associated with the Virgin Mary, was a symbol of purity and fidelity. Of course, if you were rich, you showed off. Brocade, fur, imported dyes, the works. Poorer brides just hoped their hems weren't muddy by the time the ceremony began. Historians still argue whether these weddings were more communal celebration or solemn sacrament. The church saw them as sacred, villagers, sometimes more like a really good excuse for feasting, dancing, and possibly a minor brawl near the ale casks. Now let's talk vows. In many places, couples would declare their intent in front of witnesses, and a priest but full mass wasn't always required. The essential moment, when you both said "I do," or some Latin equivalent, and exchanged whatever passed for rings. Not everyone could afford jewelry. Sometimes it was a borrowed ring, or even a twisted bit of ribbon or cord. The symbolism mattered more than the bling. One often overlooked element was the consent. Technically, both parties had to say yes freely. But let's be honest, freedom was a slippery concept, especially for women. Family pressure, social status, or even just the threat of being left unmarried, could all influence a choice. And yet, medieval courts did recognize forced marriages as invalid. There are recorded cases of women successfully dissolving unions they never agreed to, though it often took years of legal wrangling and some serious guts. After the vows, time for the celebration. Cue the wedding procession, a noisy, joyful, and sometimes incredibly awkward parade, from the church to the feast hall, or the field with the least mud. Musicians played. People sang. Children tossed petals or grain. And the newlyweds, they got pelted with nuts, fruits, or even coins, depending on the region. Symbolism, fertility, prosperity, and also snacks at the feast. Everyone got involved. Tables groaned under trenchers of meat, fish if it was Friday, and heaps of pottage. Ale flowed like water because it was cleaner than water. Minstrels sang borderline inappropriate ballads. Aunts made inappropriate comments about future grandchildren. There were toasts, roasts, and someone always tried to steal the bride's shoe, tradition. And yes, there was dancing. Remember those structured court dances? Now they got rowdy. If you didn't know the steps, you just followed the person in front of you and hoped for the best. One hand in the air. One hand on someone's goat welcome to matrimony. A slightly uncomfortable moment. The bedding ceremony. In some places, the newlyweds were literally led to their wedding bed by their friends and family. There might be prayers, songs, or even wine thrown onto the sheets, seriously. Thankfully, most people then left and let the couple have a moment of privacy, though not always. Some customs involved staying to watch. Yep, let's not dwell on that still. For all the chaos, something tender often emerged. Amid the clanging goblets, the flower petals, and the pressure of dowries and land rights, you might look over at your new spouse and think, I chose right. Or at least, I'll learn to like you. And in the Middle Ages, that was often enough to build a life together. So now, as the bells ring out and the villagers raise their cups, you take your partners, hand-calloused, warm, a little sweaty, and step into your new life together. It's been a few weeks since the wedding feast, and you're settling into the rhythms of married life. You've learned how your partner snores like a mildly offended piglet, how they fold linens with military precision, and how they insist on lighting the fire exactly the same way every morning. It's not all poetry and pottage, but it's yours. Now comes the most unglamorous but vital part of any medieval relationship, staying married. And believe it or not, that's where things really get weird. Because medieval love didn't end at the wedding, it got stranger, more symbolic, more heavily scrutinized. Staying together meant navigating a tangled mess of church doctrine, social customs, bodily superstitions, and yes, even astrological charts. Strap in. A mainstream historical fact, the church saw marriage as a sacrament, permanent, spiritual bond not to be broken lightly. Divorce, forget it. It barely existed, at least not in the way we understand it today. The most you could hope for was annulment. And even that required proving the marriage had never been valid in the first place. Wrong bloodline, sure. Prior vows to a convent, that might work. Not feeling it anymore. Not a chance. Which meant once you were in, you were in. And that brought pressure. Community pressure, family pressure, and religious pressure all kept couples together, for better or worse. Still, couples found creative ways to make things work, or at least survive the awkward silences. Quirky tidbit, in parts of medieval Europe, couples were told to avoid intimacy on specific days of the week. Not just Sundays or holy days. Tuesdays were frowned upon too, for reasons lost to time. Then there were the prohibited seasons: Lent, Advent, and the days leading up to major feast days. If you actually followed all the church's restrictions, you'd have about 12 approved nights per year to be affectionate. Not exactly a recipe for passion, but that didn't mean affection disappeared. Far from it. Medieval couples expressed love through shared labor, through symbolic gestures, and through surprisingly tender moments recorded in the margins of household records and personal letters. A husband who repaired his wife's loom without being asked. Swoon, a wife who added herbs to her husband's soup to soothe his aching joints. Peak romance. Some couples wrote each other after marriage, especially when separated by travel or war. These letters were often warm, personal, and oddly modern. I miss your voice. The bed feels cold. Tell the chickens I said hello. Okay, maybe that last one was less romantic, but still. Historians still argue whether most medieval marriages were emotionally fulfilling or simply functional. Some believe that the lack of romantic expectation actually helped couples develop stronger bonds over time. Others point to the many recorded cases of resentment, infidelity, and occasional axe-related incidents and conclude that no, this wasn't exactly marital bliss. Still, we do have stories, letters, wills, poems suggesting real affection. One man, in 15th century Yorkshire, left his wife a collection of love notes sewn into a linen pillow. A woman in Bruges commissioned a stained glass window depicting her and her husband holding hands under a fig tree, smiling slightly, as if they were sharing an inside joke. Of course, some couples fared worse. Abuse, betrayal, and abandonment existed, just as they do today. And while the church preached patience, it rarely intervened. Women, in particular, had few options if their husbands were cruel. In some towns, a wife could appeal to the local bishop or town council, but success depended on her family's influence, and whether anyone believed her side of the story. Still, for the average couple, farmers, tradesfolk, minor gentry, marriage meant building a shared world. That might include raising children or grieving those lost, managing livestock, growing gardens, brewing ale, surviving illness, navigating taxes, and maybe, just maybe, laughing at the same joke 10 years in a row. And then there's the astrological angle. Quirky, yes, but totally real. Many believed that the planets and stars influenced not only marriage compatibility, but even the success of particular days. A local wise woman or priest astrologer might cast charts to determine whether you and your partner were in harmony. Venus in Libra, excellent. Mars in Scorpio, uh-oh. Mercury in retrograde. Don't even look at each other. Even more peculiar, dream interpretations. It was common to believe that dreams foretold your marital future. If a woman dreamed of bread, it meant security. If she dreamed of wolves, beware betrayal. And if you both dreamed of water, better start building a boat or praying. Meanwhile, the community kept watch. Neighbors noted how often you smiled at each other, how much bread you baked, whether your spouse helped fetch water or just shouted orders from a stool. Gossip, ever the medieval fuel source, kept relationships public, whether you wanted them to be or not. Want to know if your marriage was healthy? The proof wasn't in public declarations, it was in the rhythm of your days. Did you share work willingly? Did your arguments stop before nightfall? Did you bring each other small comforts without being asked? Those were the markers of success. Sometimes, staying married meant weathering not just life's trials, but each other's strange habits. Maybe your husband kept insisting on singing psalms before breakfast. Maybe your wife always added too much salt. You rolled with it. You adapted. You learned to laugh, because beneath the traditions and the church mandates, beneath the dowries and family deals, medieval love endured in quiet corners. A shared blanket, a smuggled sweet, a story told before sleep. It might not have looked like fairy tales, but it was real. So now, as you sit by the fire in your little stone cottage, watching your spouse mend a tunic by candlelight, you realize something. You may never have gotten the epic love poem or the falcon gift basket, but you've built something. And in a world full of fleas, famine, and finicky lords, that is a miracle. The rooster hasn't even crowed yet, but you're already up, stretching your stiff limbs beside a fire that's barely warm. Outside, the sky is still dark, the fields silent, the village asleep except for one other house. A flicker of candlelight through the shutters, a soft clatter of something dropped, and then the unmistakable hush of two people trying not to wake the world. It's your neighbors, and it's their anniversary. Not a grand affair, no vials, no feasts, no pageantry. Just a warm loaf wrapped in cloth, a simple garland of dried herbs, and two people remembering they've survived another year of marriage. This quiet, almost sacred practice reminds you that in the Middle Ages, rituals didn't stop after the wedding. In fact, some of the most meaningful ones happened after the altar had long faded into memory. We're talking anniversaries, superstitions, domestic rituals, those little acts of commitment, protection, and yes, sometimes mild magical insurance that kept medieval relationships stitched together. A mainstream historical fact, medieval people marked anniversaries, though not in the way we do today. There weren't candlelit dinners or awkwardly wrapped gift baskets. But couples, especially those with means or religious leanings, might attend Mass together, commission a prayer, or donate alms in honor of the day. It wasn't about celebrating love so much as acknowledging that you'd made it despite plagues, taxes, and in-laws. Still, little gestures mattered. Lighting a candle together, planting a tree, weaving new straw into the mattress. These were their love languages, and often, they had a kind of sacred quality. Even the humblest acts could feel like renewal. Now for a quirky tradition, in some regions, particularly in Central Europe, couples performed love blessings on their homes. This often happened on significant days and anniversaries, feast days, or even just after a hard winter. Together, they'd sweep the house from back to front, while chanting protective verses or prayers. They'd sprinkle salt along windowsills, or place iron nails above the threshold to keep harmony in. Was it effective? Who knows? But it gave the couple a shared task, a moment of intimacy disguised as household maintenance. And then there's the food. Oh yes, nothing says, "I still love you," like an egged pie with herbs picked at sunrise. Certain foods were believed to strengthen bonds. Fennel for fidelity. Honey for sweetness, both literal and metaphorical. Garlic to ward off both sickness and unwanted suitors. Anniversary meals, especially for those who could afford them, included bread kneaded together or wine poured into a shared cup. A symbolic "we are still one." Historians still argue whether these home rituals were truly about love or just another layer of survival. After all, in a world filled with unpredictable forces and natural, spiritual, and man-made, doing something to protect your relationship made sense. But the line between practical and sentimental was always a bit blurred in medieval life. Was weaving a love not just tradition, or a heartfelt expression? Was rubbing rosemary on your spouse's boots a charm, or just a sign that you cared? They got home safely. Another odd but delightful anniversary ritual. Pillow charms. In some households, wives would tuck small tokens, ribbons, dried petals, or even written verses into their husband's sleeping pillow on special days. It was meant to invoke good dreams, fertility, or sometimes just remind them to stop snoring. One record from 1392 describes a woman who sewed a miniature heart-shaped pouch filled with lavender into her husband's pillow to sweeten his dreams and soften his tone. Adorable and passive-aggressive. There were also more public displays. In some villages, couples would walk the boundaries of their land together once a year, holding hands, stopping to say thanks for what they'd built. It was called beating the bounds in some areas and had religious overtones. But for married couples, it doubled as a moment of reflection, a slow stroll around your shared world. A reminder that everything you owned, meager or grand, you owned together. Of course, not every tradition was romantic. There were preventative rituals, to keep the marriage from falling apart. For example, a few folk remedies advised hanging a blessed piece of wedding clothing, like a veil or belt, in the bedroom to bind affection. If things were really tense, some couples even visited local wise women for bonding potions. You don't want to know what went into them. Actually, you do. Hedgehog spines, bat blood, and powdered rose hips. Medieval marriage counseling at its finest. And just when you think things can't get weirder, enter anniversary socks. In some parts of Flanders, it became fashionable for women to knit or mend a pair of socks for their husbands each year, usually dyed in the same color as their wedding day garments. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic, or just a convenient excuse to replace stinky footwear. But the result was a sort of annual textile time capsule, like pressing your love into wool. Then there were the songs. In some households, couples composed a new verse each year to an old familiar tune. These love rounds were passed down, modified, sung after supper, or mumbled over chores. It wasn't Shakespeare, but it was personal, and yes, anniversaries weren't always joyful. Sometimes they were bittersweet, marked by memory instead of celebration. A child lost, a failed harvest, a missing spouse. But even then, the date still mattered. Lighting a candle, whispering a prayer, sitting together in silence. It was grief, yes, but shared grief. And in that, something sacred still remained. So tonight, as you watch the candlelight flicker through your neighbor's window, you find yourself smiling. Not out of envy, but recognition. You see your own marriage reflected there, the quiet rhythms, the shared burdens, the rituals that no one else notices. Love in the Middle Ages wasn't loud. It didn't come with trumpets or garlands every year. It was whispered into soups, stitched into hems, hidden under pillows, and pressed into the corners of cottages. And if you're lucky, it's still burning on the other side of the shutters. The years roll on, and the seasons begin to blur. Springs, rains, summer's harvest, autumn's smoke, winter's silence, they all move through your life like verses in an endless song. And through it all, your partner remains steady, familiar, maddening, necessary. You're not newlyweds anymore. You've moved into the long middle of marriage, the part no bard ever sings about, the part where real love either strengthens or stalls. And in the Middle Ages, long-term partnership came with its own strange set of rhythms, expectations, and of course rituals for survival. Because while the wedding might have been blessed by priests, it was the daily grind that tested the vows. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval society wasn't built for privacy. You and your spouse likely lived in a one-room home, shared your space with children, animals, in-laws, and visiting pilgrims. There were no his and hers towel racks, no scented bath bombs, no couples therapy unless you count confessing to the same priest. Just two people trying to make a life in very tight quarters. So how did they stay together? Well, for starters, by dividing labor clearly, but not always rigidly. Women often managed the household, cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, brewing, even managing accounts or overseeing apprentices. Men handled outside work, fields, trades, contracts, warfare. But plenty of overlap existed, and smart couples learned to trade tasks, or at least not complain when the other didn't do it perfectly. Think, I stirred the pottage for 6 hours, while you fixed that leaky roof. A medieval version of, we're in this together. One quirky practice that helped. Shared storytelling. In long winter evenings, couples told tales, sometimes bawdy, sometimes heroic, often utterly ridiculous to entertain each other. A wife might recount a fable while spinning wool. A husband might share village gossip while carving a spoon. These stories weren't just time fillers. They were bonding tools. Inside jokes developed. Favorite characters became shorthand for how the day went. Don't go all Sir Baldric about it, you'd mutter, and they'd laugh. Remembering that clumsy knight from last winter's tales, historians still argue whether these everyday rituals served more as survival mechanisms than emotional connection. Did shared work simply force people to get along, or did it cultivate true intimacy over time? One thing's for sure, love had less to do with passion and more to do with trust, patience, and knowing how your partner liked their eggs. Of course, you could afford eggs. Let's talk about gifts. No, not jewels or romantic dinners. Medieval love tokens were different. A husband might craft a wooden spoon with a decorative handle, carved with hearts, or a few initials. A wife might embroider a tunic collar with a new design, subtle, but meaningful. One couple in late 13th century Cornwall famously exchanged walnuts filled with tiny scrolls of poetry, each sealed with wax and hidden under the mattress until winter. That's both adorable and slightly suspicious, and don't underestimate the power of nicknames. Private ones, not shouted across the village square. He might call her my foxglove because she's beautiful and low-key poisonous when provoked. She might call him strawshoe because he once made his own footwear and tripped into a duck pond. Pet names weren't invented by millennials when it came to conflict. Things got ... medieval literally. There are records of marital courts where couples could air grievances in front of community elders. These weren't punishments, but public counseling. Sometimes symbolic acts were required, like sharing a drink together in silence, or walking around the village hand in hand while neighbors watched. Humiliating maybe, effective. Arguably more than modern comment threads. Quirkier still, in some German towns, long-married couples reenacted their wedding every 7 years. Not with full pomp, but a small ceremony where they restated vows and shared ale with their children. Occasionally, they even wore their original outfits, altered of course. Because medieval food was surprisingly heavy on the bread, one forgotten tradition. The joint ledger. Wealthier couples, especially merchants and artisans, kept a shared book recording, not just expenses, but little notes. John bought new candles, to pence. Marjorie mended cloak, no charge. And sometimes even sweet entries like, shared plum tart. Both agreed it was too tart. An early version of shared calendars and inside jokes, all in ink. There was also seasonal nesting. As winter set in, families rearranged bedding, closed off parts of the home, and brought in herbs to scent the air. Couples often took this chance to reinforce domestic harmony, patching clothes together, reorganizing tools, repairing what had worn down, including, ideally, their tempers. It was a physical ritual, yes, but also symbolic, preparing for another long stretch together. And yet, for all the shared effort, some couples drifted. Emotional distance existed, just as it does now. Maybe he stopped listening. Maybe she stopped talking. Maybe grief carved a canyon between them no amount of lentil soup could fill. And while separation wasn't common, emotional separation, oh, that was universal. The Middle Ages were human, after all. Still, they kept going. Not because of fairy tale endings, but because of the small glues of everyday life. A quiet smile at the end of a hard day. A freshly mended cloak without being asked. A bowl of warm ale left by the fire after a stormy night. So tonight, you and your partner sit side by side, exhausted from mending the fence. With mud on your boots and straw in your hair. You lean back, sip your soup, and hear them say, "We still make a good team." And that's medieval love at its most honest. Not flashy, not perfect, just enduring. By now, your hands are calloused from years of work. Your back protests more than it used to. And the sound of your partner's laugh is one of the few things that still cuts clean through the noise of village life. You've seen each other through famine, flood, childbirth, and tax collectors. You've mended each other's cloaks and tempers. You're not just a couple anymore. You're a unit, a legend whispered about by the apprentices and newlyweds. And as odd as it sounds, in the Middle Ages, you might now be relationship goals. But with that longevity came something else, a new stage of love. One less concerned with passion and more entwined with purpose. Growing old together in the medieval world wasn't just rare, it was radical at mainstream historical fact. The average life expectancy in medieval Europe was low, often quoted around 30 to 40 years. But that number is skewed by high infant mortality. If you made it past childhood and didn't die of the plague, war, or childbirth, you had a decent shot at living into your 60s, or even beyond. And if you managed to do it with your spouse still by your side, well, that was a feat worth celebrating. In some regions, long married couples were publicly honored. In villages from Ireland to Italy, it wasn't uncommon for couples to be toasted at feast days or invited to sit beside the village priest at processions. Not because they were important, but because they'd endured. Endurance was the highest praise you could give a couple. No one was expecting romance at that point. Just quiet, lasting companionship. Maybe a shared flask of cider, if your joints weren't acting up. Here's a quirky bit. In certain French provinces, elderly couples were granted the ceremonial spoons of peace. These were carved, wooden spoons tied together by a cord, symbolizing the harmony they'd achieved over decades. They'd eat from them at special meals, usually very slowly, and sometimes give them to their children as marriage blessings. The spoons weren't magical, but people whispered that marriages blessed by the spoon couple had fewer arguments over firewood. You and your partner may not be dancing anymore. Not unless someone's holding both your elbows, but you've developed an elegant choreography all your own. A knowing glance here, a sigh that says everything, a touch that smooths over an entire afternoon. Communication becomes nonverbal. You just know when it's time to fetch the kindling, or when they need a moment to sit in silence. Historians still argue whether medieval elderly couples were treated with reverence or regarded as burdens. It varied widely. In some communities, they were honored as wisdom keepers and family anchors. In others, aging came with marginalization, especially for widows. But for couples who aged together, their homes often became unofficial gathering, places full of stories, dried herbs, and grandchildren asking questions like, "Did you really see a comet on your wedding day?" Speaking of grandchildren, that's one of the great joys of long-lasting medieval love, the expansion of the family circle. Seeing your children marry, have children of their own, and try to wrangle all the chaos you once navigated was both hilarious and deeply satisfying. You'd offer advice mostly ignored, tell stories mostly exaggerated, and occasionally step in to show them how to gut a fish properly or knead dough without breaking a wrist. One cherished but overlooked tradition was the elder's bench. In many village centers, a carved bench sat beneath a tree or by the well reserved for older couples who'd earned their place. Sitting there wasn't just about resting your knees, it was about bearing witness. You watched the village grow, change, fall apart, rebuild. And sometimes, when a younger couple had an argument, they'd come sit near the bench not for scolding, but to remember what patience looked like. Of course, it wasn't all peaceful evenings and wisdom. Aging brought its own set of challenges: illness, weakness, the creeping fear of losing one another. And in those moments, love deepened not because it was poetic, but because it was necessary. You relied on each other in ways you hadn't before, helping dress, feeding soup, sitting up during coughing fits, whispering prayers when the night felt too long, but also laughter. So much laughter. You laughed at memories, at aching joints, at the absurdity of life. You teased each other about your thinning hair and your stubbornness. You competed to see who could make the younger grandchildren roll their eyes first. And when the moment came when the first gray hair was spotted, you didn't groan. You plucked it out and made a game of it. Whoever finds the most gray hairs by sundown wins my last apple. There were even songs about couples like you. Folk ballads about the old farmer and his patient wife, about the woman who saw her husband through 3 lords and 2 droughts. You became the stuff of story and song, not for your beauty or daring, but for your longevity. In a world where everything was uncertain, your marriage was evidence that something could last. There's a quiet power in that. A love that outlasts plagues and political shifts. A bond not marked by epic moments, but by thousands of small ones. Picking herbs, sitting by fires, brushing crumbs off each other's sleeves, walking hand in hand at half the pace you used to. And one day, someone might ask how you stayed together so long. You'll smile and say something like, "She made a stew I couldn't live without." Or, "He always let me have the dry corner of the bed when it rained." You won't talk about vows or saints or dowries. You'll talk about kindness, about showing up, about choosing each other again and again through every mundane, marvelous season. So here you sit side by side on a worn bench beneath the same tree that once shaded your wedding. You've said all there is to say. You've survived everything worth surviving. And your hand still finds theirs without even looking. The seasons turn again, and now the rhythm of your days has slowed. Your hands are no longer calloused, they're gnarled, joints thickened like old oak roots, but still warm when they reach for your spouses in the early light. You don't rise with the sun anymore. You rise when your bones allow it, when the birds start their quiet gossip, and the village slowly wakes around you. You're in the final chapters now, the twilight of medieval marriage, when time feels both fragile and generous. You've lived through youth, duty, quarrels, joy, and years that blurred together like watercolor on parchment. Now it's quiet, not empty, just softer. It's easy to forget how rare this is. Growing old together in the Middle Ages, practically a miracle. Disease, childbirth, war, accidents, famine, all could have pulled one or both of you away long ago. But here you are, wrapped in a shared life that's outlasted monarchs, bad harvests, and an entire generation of gossip. And with that longevity comes one of the era's strangest and most tender customs: preparing for separation. Because in a world that believed so strongly in the soul's journey after death, aging couples often approached their eventual parting with both sorrow and intention. A mainstream historical fact. Late medieval Christianity placed heavy emphasis on a good death, dying in a state of grace, with your spiritual affairs in order. But for married couples, that preparation was often a shared task. You didn't just write your will. You talked about what would happen after one of you went on ahead, practical. Yes, but also profoundly intimate. Quirky custom. In parts of medieval England, it was common for long-married couples to line rest together, not as a funeral rite, but as a symbolic rehearsal. They'd lie side by side on a blanket, hold hands, and whisper prayers together. Some added tokens like shared rosaries, or a scrap of their wedding garment to keep in the coffer where burial cloths were stored. It wasn't morbid, it was peaceful. A promise that even death wouldn't end the bond, and those tokens. Fascinating in their variety. One couple in 14th century Normandy pressed their fingerprints into beeswax tablets and buried them beneath their cottage floor. Another wrapped their initials in copper wire and fastened it to the inside of a wooden chest. You'd expect saints' relics in these hiding places, but instead, you find dried flowers, scraps of song lyrics, even an old spoon that had served them every Lent for 40 years. Historians still argue whether these rituals were expressions of romantic love or simply spiritual habit. But when you look closely, when you read the wills and the letters and the margin notes, there's tenderness, a kind of love that isn't loud, but echoes. In one 1370 will, from a widow named Isabeau, she writes, "And let him know I folded his best shirt, with lavender between, so that he would sleep sweetly in heaven." That's not duty, that's devotion. In those final years, marriage took on a new form, less about doing and more about being. You weren't raising children anymore. You weren't haggling over goats or rushing to the market. You were just existing together. And in a world that valued purpose above all, simply being together was quietly radical. One rare but lovely practice. Memory cloths. Some couples stitched simple wall hangings that marked shared events. A particularly hard winter, a wedding day, a child's birth or death. These weren't elaborate tapestries, just humble pieces of cloth with symbols, initials, and sometimes crude drawings. They hung by the hearth, or in the sleeping corner, like a lived-in scrapbook. When one partner died, the surviving spouse often gave the cloth to a child, or placed it in the grave, folded like a final letter. And yes, sometimes grief came first. Maybe you were the one left behind. Maybe you sat at the bedside, holding a hand that had once lifted pails, mended seams, pointed out constellations. You whispered familiar words. A joke, a prayer. Maybe just silence. When the breath finally stopped, it didn't feel like an end. Just a long pause. Afterward, mourning customs took over. You wore black or, if poor, simply turned your tunic inside out. You sat beside the hearth and retold stories. You pressed a token into the folds of a burial shroud. And maybe if the day was still, you went for one more walk around the boundaries you once beat together, remembering every step as a prayer. But for some, the story didn't end there. There were cases strange, rare, and beautiful of widows, and widowers choosing not to remarry, not out of duty, but out of continued connection. They tended to their spouse's grave, spoke to them, left small offerings, a sprig of mint, a pinch of flour, a stone warmed in the hearth. Some villages even whispered that long-married souls could still communicate in dreams. You'd wake with a familiar warmth, a whispered phrase on your lips. A sudden memory of that morning 50 years ago, when they chased a pig through the village square and tripped over their own shoe. And if you both lived to a ripe old age, passing only days or weeks apart, villagers often believed it was divine mercy. The bond was too strong to break for long. A tale in a 15th century Irish manuscript tells of an elderly couple who died within 3 sunrises of each other, and how their burial shrouds appeared mysteriously knotted together when lowered into the earth. That's the thing with medieval love. It was never about sweeping gestures or poetic declarations. It was about staying, through sickness, sorrow, celebration, and silence. Through every season, through every stretch of hard bread and hard feelings. So now, as the fire dims and the village settles into sleep, you reach once more for your partner's hand. You don't need words. You don't need promises. You just need the warmth, the weight, the memory of a life fully shared. You've loved like a medieval soul, quietly, stubbornly, and all the way to the end. The cottage is quieter now than it has ever been. The fire crackles in low whispers, casting amber ripples against the old stone walls. The tools hang in their usual places. The herbs, dried long ago, sway faintly in the breeze that slips through the shutters. And there you are, older than you ever expected to be, wrapped in a woven shawl that your spouse mended dozens of times. Each stitch a little thread of memory. You don't do much these days. You don't need to. The heavy work has passed. Now, your mornings begin with warm tea and silence. Sometimes a neighbor stops by. Sometimes a grandchild pokes their head in, full of questions about what courting was like back when the roads were made of mud. You answer with a smirk, because, yes, it was mud, and lice, and bands and bread and long, aching winters. Somehow it all added up to love. This final stretch of life isn't marked by pageantry. No songs are sung for the quiet loyalty of staying together through decades of blistered hands and cramped beds, but it leaves a mark, a strong one. You don't need a monument. You've lived one. A mainstream historical fact. In some medieval towns, long-married couples were gently mythologized. Stories of their love were passed down in households, and retold at local festivals not as epic romances, but as examples of how things ought to be. They became reference points. If a young couple squabbled too loudly, someone might say, well, old Hilda and Rolf didn't shout, they just baked 2 loaves, and each ate their own. And yes, some of that was idealization. Not every couple was so lucky. But those who laughed and labored side by side left behind a kind of social wisdom that outlived them, and that wisdom took shape in rituals, sayings, even local laws. Here's a quirky farewell tradition. In some corners of Germany and Denmark, a long-wed couple would be given a ceremonial broom. On the day they could no longer work the fields, or keep house as they once did, the broom was hung above their doorway, bristles up. It meant, they've done their sweeping. Leave them be. No more chores. Just rest, and memories. Sometimes, rest arrived in pairs. There are medieval burial sites where archaeologists have uncovered couples laid to rest side by side, their hands gently touching. One pair in northern Italy, buried sometime around the 14th century, were found facing each other, their arms arched inward, as if embracing even in death. Their bones told stories of shared diets, matching injuries, even synchronized aging. The story ends with them, but it also doesn't. Historians still argue whether these twin burials were romantic gestures, practical arrangements, or just lucky coincidence. But standing before those 2 skeletons, perfectly aligned after centuries, it's hard not to feel something stir. Not every love gets a poem, but some love writes itself in bone.you. Now, in the quiet of your final days, don't think much about courtship anymore. You remember it vaguely. The nervous beginnings, the whispered vows, the morning after the banns when you both realized you hadn't exactly planned what came next. You remember the middle years more clearly, planting, praying, arguing, forgiving, laughing, and now you remember everything else. The way their hand looked while gutting fish, the exact sound they made when sneezing, the tiny scar just above their brow, from the time they ducked too late in the apple orchard. You don't think of love as a feeling anymore. You think of it as a landscape one. You've crossed slowly with tired legs and a full heart, and when your breath begins to thin, when your fingers tremble more than usual, when the edges of the day blur into sleep, you think of that landscape, the steps you walked together, the path you carved, not perfectly, not without mud and missteps, but completely, fully. Your story isn't one for the minstrels or the poets, but it's a story that matters. A story stitched into aprons, etched into window panes, whispered over supper. You were part of a love that lasted, and in the Middle Ages, that was the real miracle. So if your final act is to sit here, one last time, watching the sun stretch across your shared bed, that's enough. More than enough. Because love in this time didn't need to be grand. It just needed to endure. And you did. Together. And now, the story slows. The candles burn low. The hearth crackles to a hush, and the cottage that held a lifetime of moments seems to breathe in sync with your own. You've traveled a long, winding path through the quiet corners of medieval love past, awkward first glances, whispered vows, shared chores, hard winters, and soft laughter. And through it all, the thread held. Let yourself sink deeper now, into the stillness. There's nothing left to do, no fields to plow, no bands to read. Just you, the faint rhythm of your breath, and the memory of hands that once warmed yours without needing to ask. The flickering fire inside your mind softens. The colors fade, but gently, never sharply. You are held, remembered, known, maybe. You find yourself lying under a linen blanket, the same one that wrapped your shoulders on your wedding night. Or perhaps you're sitting on that old bench near the well, listening to the familiar voice of someone you've loved for longer than you ever thought you'd live. Their voice is quiet now, almost part of the breeze, as they tell the same joke they told every autumn when the leaves turned gold. You smile. You've heard it before. You'll hear it again in dreams, in memory, in the hush between waking and sleep. Now, close your eyes. Let the weight of history settle around you like a second blanket. You're safe. You're loved. You are home.